Let's get started. So as I just referenced, there's a small but growing interdisciplinary field called knowledge transfer or knowledge exchange. Much of this research area is descriptive, comes out of surveys and interviews with researchers, decision makers, funders, and advocates, trying to understand what are the conditions under which research evidence is more or less used into the decision-making process. Rather than focus on any one study in this area of research, I'm going to summarize and rely on a lot of review articles that come from this area, and all of the references will be available to you on the mini course website. I also want to clarify that I'm going to use the word policymaker most frequently, but what I'm really referring to is any decision maker that you wish to influence, and that may not be a policymaker. It could be someone in the executive branch, it could be an elected official, or it could simply be a key advocate that you want to advocate on your behalf, or someone with leadership in an organization. So when I say policymaker, really think of it as analogous to the end user. Who do you want to be the ultimate audience for your research who can take action to make social change? So as we think about how best you should be disseminating your research so it has more of an impact on the policy process, it's important to understand some broad strokes about the policymaking process in general. And of course, it's a huge challenge to summarize an entire body of work on policymaking in the field of public policy and political science in a single slide, but I thought there were some important key themes to go over. First, policymakers make decisions for a variety of reasons. Individual policymakers have policy legacies that they're concerned about. They have past decisions that they want to keep up with. And so policymakers' past decisions can often influence the way they're going to vote or think about issues that are emerging. They also have demands from stakeholders, from interest groups. And ultimately, policymakers have an eye on their own personal incentive, which, particularly in an election year, is making decisions that they judge to be aligned with getting reelected and having their constituents' support. I think it's also important to understand that a lot of policymaking happens on a very short-term time horizon, but each individual decision may be part of a longer-term political strategy that that decision has in mind to carve out their record in a particular policy arena. So the key question for us then is thinking about what role does research evidence or research-based information have to play in policymaking? And first I should point out that for many types of policy agenda issues, there may not be research evidence that's available or accessible. But when there is, it's often competitive with other types of information and other types of experiences that matter to policymakers, like public opinion, norms, values, ideologies, and principles, and other types of experiences and expertise. So let's talk about a specific example that comes out of my research. I conducted a study with colleagues in Minnesota designed to quantify the extent to which research evidence about obesity was cited in legislative discussion about obesity-related bills. So I pulled a sample of documents, including meeting minutes, legislative briefings, oral testimony, and video and audio, and quantified how often research evidence was cited in those materials. And this concerned 13 bills that had been introduced in the state between 2007 and 2011. So that comprised our sample. And what we found was that fewer than half, or 41% of this material, cited any research evidence at all. But the vast majority cited this other types of non-research-based information that I just described as competitive with research-based information, like public opinion, like information about costs, expertise without referencing any research-based information, political principles, or policy outcomes and decisions in other states. Now, obesity may be kind of a best case example because there's a lot of research available on the prevalence of obesity and the consequences of obesity on youth and in a variety of outcomes. And so the limited use of research in this case can't simply be because research wasn't available. But we do know that the use of evidence is influenced by a number of characteristics. For instance, how relevant is the research to the question at hand? Is the research available in a timely way? Is it salient to the issue? And is it actionable? Research suggests, and particularly reviews of a bulk of research, finds that decision makers want actionable research, not just basic descriptive information that they don't know what to do with. The legitimacy of the research also matters. In interviews I've conducted with policymakers, I hear a lot about the credibility of research. Policymakers know that not all research is great, that not all research is equally sound. I've heard policymakers refer to junk science, so they're aware that research may not all be legitimate, and they also are keenly aware that the messenger matters. If research is not communicated by a credible messenger, it's unlikely to be used in policymaking. Finally, the accessibility of the research also matters. How is it formatted? Is it a 25-page report like we typically do when we're producing research, or is it something where researchers can glean the main points out of, like a research brief? And is it available to them, again, at the time that they need it? Of course, the perceptions of the end users also matter. And decision makers who don't want to use this information or don't see the value of research evidence aren't going to use it, particularly when there's a huge competition for the attention of policymakers, which is a scarce resource indeed. But I think it's useful to think about which of these characteristics are in our control as research leaders. So I would argue that we can control how relevant our research is by working with decision makers and community leaders to create relevant, actionable research. We can also do the best work possible to make sure it's legitimate and communicated within the context of trusted relationships to policymakers. So that's also in our control. How accessible and how well formatted our research briefs are, that's also in our control. Changing decision makers' views, on the other hand, may not be the best place to devote your energy, particularly within a 2 to 3 year time frame, such as in this program. So unfortunately, much academic research doesn't meet the criteria I just described. It's often poorly timed with policy cycles and policy needs. The research findings do not seem actionable, they seem ambiguous, and often this comes out of the language that we use in describing our findings, the confidence intervals around the findings that we create. There's also just too much of it, too much research evidence, so it's hard to know where to start. And we don't often present our research in useful forms beyond a peer-reviewed publication. And finally, some researchers aren't willing to actively and personally be involved in policymaking, and that's okay. All researchers don't have to do this work to do engaged, actionable research, but you, participants in the IRL program, ought to be invested in taking the risk to be actively and personally engaged in the process. Throughout this program, we're going to talk about some of the major concerns that researchers describe in doing policy relevant and policy disseminated work, like concern about objectivity versus subjectivity. We'll talk about that. About the career incentives, that there aren't institutional incentives to do this work. We'll talk about that as well, and we hope that partly the IRL program can maybe shift these incentives a little bit. So starting with research in 1979 by Kaplan, researchers have long sought to understand why it is that the research translation process falls short, why policymakers seem to insufficiently rely on scholarly research in their work and in their decisions. And the major theory that has come out of this work is called the two communities theory, which we can think of as basically that researchers are on Mars, policymakers are on Venus. They don't even inhabit the same planet. They have different priorities, different training, different values, different timing of the work that they do, different types of incentives and rewards, and different decision-making processes. And all of these contribute to this enormous gap between the two groups. This area of research suggests that forming stronger relationships is critical to bridge that gap. And there's a lot of work to summarize all of these different differences between researchers and policymakers that exist. And a lot of these are going to be pretty intuitive to you. For instance, whereas researchers have the incentives of getting published and writing grants, policymakers have their major incentive as getting recognition for the hard work that they're doing and getting reelected. The important opinion leaders to researchers are leading scholars, whereas for policymakers, they care about the views and the opinions of civic leaders, their contributors, and the political leaders in their coalition and their parties. Their time frame, as I already mentioned, are really different, with researchers really thinking about a long time frame, from research idea all the way to producing research evidence and communicating it. whereas policymakers operate with short windows of opportunity in which they can act to tackle important policy questions. Another review paper by Mitten summarizes all the different types of barriers on the one hand to using research evidence in policymaking and facilitators. And they divide these up into different levels. So at the individual level, there may be researchers who lack the experience and capacity for communicating their work to policymakers. And on the flip side, there are policymakers that lack the experience and capacity for assessing evidence and making use of it in their work. So facilitators then include building collaborations between researchers and policymakers, creating stronger networks, and building trust so that the sense of mistrust and disconnect between those two communities is less strong. At the organizational level, I already mentioned there may be institutional norms against doing policy-related work. Unsupportive culture also applies to the policy-making bodies, which may not have a culture in which seeking out the best evidence is valued and is supported by resources like having research bodies on the staff of state legislators. So at the organizational level, we can facilitate better use of evidence with more support and more training on both sides, on the researcher side and the policymaker side, and making sure that there is sufficient resources to doing this type of work well. We'll talk at the communication level in a few slides, but basically, researchers may not have the impact they want because of a poor choice of messenger or simply providing too much information. And communication facilitators then include being a little more parsimonious with the communication, but making those messages count, and involving decision makers early on in the stage of research planning and communication so that the research question and products might be better tailored to fit a decision maker's needs and priorities. So there have been some critiques of this two communities theory. So essentially, if you frame the problem of insufficient research evidence translating to policymakers as one that there's this gap between the two communities, that leads to some maybe inappropriate ways of thinking about the right solutions. So first of all, talking about these two communities implies a linear model from researcher to policymaker, and this is not an appropriate way of characterizing the policymaking process. The policymaking process is messy. It has lots of inputs, and it can often be cyclical, rather than a linear process that we might hope helps us get our research to take action. It also, this linear model or this two communities model also ignores the roles that research might have long before a specific policy decision is needed. Research can shape public beliefs and policymaker beliefs about the causes of a problem or the solution to that problem well before a policy decision is met. And I think a great example here is the social determinants of health. If policymakers draw from the literature around the social determinants of health, they might come to think of housing or of early childhood as policy areas that have important and rich health components to them. And this type of framing and this type of agenda setting and causal understanding could shape the policy trajectory. But if you asked a policymaker, did they use research evidence in that area to make their decision, they might say no. But we would understand that there's many other ways in which research can influence the policy process. And finally, I think this two communities theory ignores the really important roles of other actors in the process. The advocates, the lobbyists, the community members, community organizers, the legislative staff who may play an important role, research institutions and funders, and journalists and social media. So a more appropriate way of visualizing the policy process might be something more like this. So this is not linear in the slightest. We have this huge structure with inputs and outputs. We have research as part of the information that's produced, and that research can shape causal beliefs about what is and what types of social problems matter. And these understandings or framings of the problem then contribute to the institutional structure of decision making in ways that may not be as measurable as, for instance, in my study when I noted how often research evidence was used in a specific legislative discussion. So related to this model that's more cyclic and nonlinear, There are multiple ways that policymakers might use research. So there's instrumental use, which is the type that's probably least common and the type that's more implied by the linear model, which is applying research results directly at the point of decision-making to solve a problem. Research may also be used symbolically to support the positions that legislators or policymakers already have, their predetermined positions. And finally, that latter point that I was just getting at is conceptual use, using research for ideas, for new ways of framing problems. One empirical study actually conducted in Canada asked government agency staff how often they used research in each of these three ways. And what they found was that while the overall numbers are pretty low use of research at all, they found that more agency staff identified using research around these ideas and problem framing than in using it directly in making a policy-making decision. So I want to conclude now by talking about different models for knowledge transfer. Probably the most traditional that's used by most researchers is producer push, where the research producers, the researchers and their research teams, actively make their research available to decision makers, often when the research has concluded. They push that research out. But another form is called user pull. So the users of the research, the decision makers themselves, they identify the research questions and they solicit trusted organizations to do the work on the questions that they need. What I think best characterizes the IRL program is the third, the exchange. So this would be joint active efforts for both researchers and decision makers to be involved in the research, in setting the agenda and asking the research question, and serving as advisors or partners in the research process as it goes forward. So thank you very much for your attention.